gosh, at some point it was just so important to be online, be on the
Online.
internet, have an email account that you just finally went ahead and got one, even though maybe it was a little bit of a pain and you didn't know what you were doing, or you had to have somebody help. I kind of think that really big technological changes. Uh, yeah, that's great. Really big technological changes are kind of like that. They almost sort of come upon us without our being able to say anything about them. People always ask me about, like, what killer app will make Second Life mainstream. I don't think there is one. I think that Second Life is simply going to get easier and easier to use so that the initial barriers to adoption become low enough to allow different types of applications to emerge. But going back to that question of, about the brain, let me say two things about business meetings. I believe that there are two really obvious reasons why the advantages of using virtual worlds for business are unavoidable and will create significant competitive advantage for those businesses who use virtual worlds, and therefore will force everyone to use them in a manner similar to how email kind of got out there. The first is that three-dimensional voice coupled with a visualization of a person has an extremely strong and positive neurological impact on you when you're using it. Now, everybody here probably just knows this because you're already using Second Life, but somebody needs to write a really good and detailed scientific study of exactly why this is and kind of put it up in black and white. But what's going on when you're sitting in a meeting in Second Life with 3D voice turned on is that your brain is doing something that in the real world it really does well and it really wants to do, which is you use the apparent direction and position of a speaker in space as a way of separating and understanding and remembering what they're saying better. The brain always puts a speaker, someone who's using words, in a physical location. The brain cannot imagine someone speaking from the ether. It imagines them as being somewhere. And when it can imagine them as having a connection to a physical location or a physical body, it is more memorable. What they say is more memorable. So what that means is that if you have and the great example of this, obviously, and I've said this before, you might have heard me say it, is think about when you're sitting at a meeting using a speakerphone and you're staring at that speakerphone. And then after a while, you become frustrated because you're like, why am I looking at this stupid phone? It's just a phone. And you try to look up at the other people, but then that feels really awkward. So you look at the ceiling. Then you kind of give up in frustration and, maybe you look back at the phone or whatever. The reason for that is that your brain is localizing the voices that it hears as being little tiny humans that are somehow inside that phone for you, because it won't do with not imagining the voice coming from a person. And so what happens is, if there are multiple people on the other end of the line, your brain images them all as being kind of trapped inside that little phone. And that's really unpleasant because when two people are right in the same exact space, when they're speaking to you from the same point in space, your brain has a hard time, for example, understanding if they both speak at the same time. We've all had that experience of having two people talk on the speakerphone at the same time, and they basically kind of have to stop and collide and back off and wait and talk again because they know that you, the listener, cannot understand when both of them talk at once. Obviously, with 3D voice, and we don't want to demonstrate this right now, but we certainly could at the end of this meeting, you can have a lot of people talking at exactly the same time, and you can still decode. Your brain can still understand them simultaneously. So that is a huge business advantage, and I think that for reasons that are, I guess, are a longer discussion, it's very likely that this kind of way of doing that, this way of doing 3D audio, is probably the simplest and most compelling way to do that.
In other words, I don't think there's going to be a custom-made application that you use to
sort of throw yourself in a sort of a semi-virtual space or a 2D virtual space for meetings. I think the general thing we're doing here is more likely to become dominant and successful. The second thing is this concept of the memory palace. If you've ever looked this up, it's a great thing to look up and read about, and I think there have been many scientific studies done on this. The memory palace idea is simply that right now we're standing in this rather odd location. I'm on a purple stage. There are palm trees in cement surrounds or whatever. There's a big rail car connected, going to nothing that says "Train for Success" on the side of it. There's these rather cool little sunshades over there in the distance that probably would fall over in real life if they were built. All of these things comprise what is essentially a unique context, a unique physical environment. So it turns out that unique physical environments are very powerful for the brain because they cause us to much better associate the sounds and communication that we're doing right now with the novel location. The greatest example of this is whether you ask yourself whether you can remember the book that you were reading on your last vacation. And then ask yourself how well you remember that book, and do you in a similar way remember the book that you were reading on your nightstand, before you went to sleep, the same amount of time ago. And what you'll find, almost everybody here will find, is that your memory of the one you read on your vacation is much better. Yeah. Kidda, if you don't remember your last vacation, I can't help you. But basically, if you read a book, if you communicate in an unusual environment, your brain is able to remember the communication much better. So what that means is that an environment like Second Life, where it is so easy to have a meeting or an offsite or a get-together in an unusual context, and of course the one we're in right now is almost kind of plain. This is a almost looks like something that we could be having this real meeting in, but obviously we could all be sitting on bamboo lounge chairs in Fiji, so to speak, having the same meeting. In fact, I guess that would be really fun. And that meeting, that business meeting on the beach in Fiji in Second Life, is going to be much more memorable. And so what that means from a competitive perspective is that if I can make it so that you can remember the meeting we had better, if you think about it, that is a very substantive competitive advantage. If businesses can communicate in a way where people have fun, sit in a context that's highly memorable, and are therefore able to, repeat back the information months later somewhat better than somebody who went to a meeting in that same conference room that's, down the hall from your office, there's a big win there. And I think that win is going to get turned into competitive advantages for businesses. So those are two things: 3D voice and this concept of memory and the memory palace and the ability to remember things that better if you're in a unique context. Those two things are going to comprise a very significant competitive business advantage. I guess the third one would just be the cost of traveling. Obviously, Second Life powerfully offsets the cost of traveling, and it's almost as fun as being there in real life. And that, again, is an enormous, deal for businesses. And I do think, and of course, again, people here probably have tried this out, it's an entirely different experience from WebEx or obviously telephone conferencing or video conferencing. It's a very different experience that we have here. It's unique and it's entirely different from what's been done thus far.